This video is brought to you by my Patreon subscribers. Thank you for supporting the show. Disney wouldn't be the same without the music. Songs are so important for their movies. It's hard to separate Ariel from Part of Your World or Mulan from Reflection. Disney also has a special place in the queer community. Sure, it's always been a complicated relationship, but many queer people like Disney. A lot of this can be traced back to the gay people who have had an influence on the company. Howard Ashman is the most well-known, and I Want songs are his legacy. Specifically, songs occur early on in a movie where the main character sings about what they want. This is now a Disney staple, and that's what most people talk about when looking at the company's influence on the queer community. But the real story is more complicated.
Salagadoola, bitchigaboola, bibbidi-bobbidi-boo. It'll do magic, believe it or not. Bibbidi-bobbidi-boo.
Musical theater is gay. Well, sort of. Not everyone in musical theater is gay, nor was the art form specifically made for gay people. But musical theater is gay. Since early on in its life, musical theater has had a specific place in the queer community, almost to the point where it seems like musical theater developed alongside gay expression.
Gay musical? Aren't all musicals gay?
It's also distinctly US American. Early on, the main difference between musicals and European operetta was US American English and influence from traditions like variety revues and later jazz. And those influences radiated outward. It didn't take long for musical theater to affect many parts of culture, including Disney. Since the beginning, Disney movies have had music, and it was influenced by musical theater. Howard Ashman saw this influence. When he was hired to write songs for The Little Mermaid with Alan Menken, he gave a famous talk about the history of the Disney animated film and how it developed alongside musical theater. But though Disney was known for musicals before, I think it was because of Ashman and Menken that Disney animated films specifically are forever tied with musical theater. When they came to the company, there was a disappearing musical presence, and they specifically chose to not only revive the Disney musical, but make it even bolder. After they began making films with the company, there was much more of a formula, including the famous I Want song. And I think it's not just the stories that make these movies so relatable for queer people, it's the format of musical theater. But to understand where queerness and musical theater connect, we have to go back. The start of musicals is debated, and many say the first one was The Black Crook from 1866, but others say something else. What's important to know is that at the time, operettas were very popular, basically a form of European opera that was considered light due to its reliance on pop music, satire, and shorter stories. This is what musicals came out of.
When the balls whistle free over the bright blue sea, we stand to our guns all day.
It's tricky to say the exact point when that happened, because genres don't usually develop overnight. But we can say that the musical started to form when US American traditions and musical styles began being used in shows. This included local pop music, slang, and a goal to entertain audiences with pure spectacle. And keep in mind, this is a very short summary of a long period, and US musical theater is a different thing than the much more general history of musical dramas and other types of theater that utilized music. While the musical was being developed in the late 1800s, so was queer culture. The word homosexuality was coined, giving people a way to describe their feelings that didn't have negative connotations. The first drag balls started popping up, gay men were writing about their experiences, and gender norms continued to be questioned. And the theater was a place where queer people could go. Gay men did not enjoy unalloyed acceptance in the theater, to be sure, but the theatrical milieu did offer them more tolerance than most workplaces. Some men could be openly gay among their co-workers, and many others were at least unlikely to suffer serious retribution if their homosexuality were discovered. So, some queer people could be themselves in theater. But what about musical theater? Well, it turns out that there had already been a queer association with operetta, specifically opéra bouffe, a type of French operetta most associated with Jacques Offenbach. His operettas were known for attracting a specific part of Parisian society, which included queer people and others who were viewed as sexually quote-unquote deviant. So, people would congregate at these shows, and this would go beyond Paris. Gilbert and Sullivan operettas in England were known for similar crowds, and even had plot lines that spoke to queer people of the time. So, there's not a point where you can see a direct connection. After all, that's not really how queer culture works. Since it's often been forced into the closet, it moves discreetly, and not all at once. So, there's not one point where queer people claimed musical theater, but we can see the beginnings of a community around it start to form. But it isn't all positive. In the US, many people's first experiences with cross-dressing and queering of gender expression came from minstrel shows that stereotyped and denigrated Black people. And it would be wrong to assume that theaters who were tolerant of gay people weren't racist, as there are long histories of racism in both theater and queer communities. The fact that this was happening around the same time that the first drag queen in the US was a formerly enslaved person shows how race affects queer experience and how racism affects the telling of history. And that follows us well into the modern day, as the way people are perceived and allowed to express themselves is still very much tied to racism. In the early 1900s, the queer community became more visible on stage. Characters like the Nance became commonplace, basically showing a caricature of effeminate men that was played for laughs.
Yes, our big annual clearance sale. Everything in the house must go.
Many Nance characters represented homophobic stereotypes, but they were also a way for queer performers of the day to get roles and be unapologetically gay. And in the music scene, gay performers continued expressing themselves. Lesbian and bisexual blues singers of the 1920s had a strong impact. Musical theater composers like Cole Porter were also inserting gay double entendres into their lyrics. And when Prohibition happened, banning all sales of alcohol, many people had to go to underground gay bars to drink, causing a boom in popularity for queer performers known as the pansy craze. And the music they performed was very much influenced by musical theater and cabaret. As I've said, there's not a single point where queerness became linked with musical theater, but with all of these influences developing alongside each other, well, they all played a role. The I Want song began at the early to mid-20th century, and as musicals started to rely more on strong storytelling, shows like Oklahoma used songs not just to entertain the audience, but to affect and move the story in specific ways. Howard Ashman did not invent the I Want song. In fact, he probably heard it while attending the BMI Lehman Angle Musical Theater Workshop, which is named after the man who is largely credited with coining the term. And this workshop was also where he met Alan Menken. In classic terms, the job of an I Want song is not to move the action forward, but to set up the desire of the leading character that will drive the action for the rest of the show. So Ashman didn't bring I Want songs to Disney. They were there from the beginning.
I'm wishing for the one I love.
And that was his point. As musical theater developed, Disney films did too, and they shared influences. As I Want songs began to appear in more shows, they became part of a formula. I mean, they're incredibly helpful to lay out the wishes of a protagonist, and it's not a coincidence that they're some of the most popular songs in musical theater. And it's also not a coincidence that they're gay. As musical theater already had a queer community surrounding it, it's not surprising to see people latch onto these abstract feelings of longing and dreaming. Celebrities like Judy Garland and songs like Over the Rainbow didn't become queer staples because they depicted queer experience. However, they also sort of did. Many queer people empathized with the hope in the song and idolized Judy Garland as a celebrity who persevered in an industry that was so harmful to her. And at a time when there wasn't really much open representation, seeing yourself in musicals and creating that space anyway was and still is a superpower. Most people associate Judy Garland, I Want songs, and musical theater as mainly being a thing with gay men, and there's some truth to that. But I've also been saying queer in this video because it's more complicated than just gay. Historically, gender and sexuality have kind of been mashed together, so gay and trans histories often intersect. Sometimes I say queer to cover the nuance of that. And of course, musical theater has fans of all genders in the queer community, not just gay men. So I Want songs have been a part of Disney since the beginning, but when Howard Ashman explicitly acknowledged them, something shifted. The influence of Ashman on the company was so huge that many people today associate I Want songs solely with Disney. They've always been iconic, but now they're a permanent staple in Disney animated musicals. And all this context, all this history is also why the I Want songs are often referenced in the queer community. Many queer people grow up in places where they're not accepted, so it only makes sense to dream your way out.
And for once it might be grand to have someone understand. I was so much more than they've got.
But that's not all. When I see people talking about the queer influence of Disney songs, they mainly talk about I Want songs. But there are plenty of songs that speak to queer people that aren't that. So why? I mean, the villain song is another archetype often celebrated by queer people, largely because of its queer-coded history. But there are still songs outside of these molds that are considered queer classics. I don't think there's one concrete explanation, but I think it's because they're musical theater, plain and simple. As I mentioned earlier, Howard Ashman and Alan Menken's influence brought a new era where the Disney animated musical became stronger than ever before. I mean, it makes sense to me that so many Disney Renaissance films have been adapted for the stage. They're already fully formed musicals nearly ready for Broadway, so they don't need much adjustment. And that's why there are songs that start to attract a queer following without fitting into the archetypes I mentioned. Musical theater as an art form has such a history of queerness that it's so easy to project queer expression onto. It can really happen to any song. I mean, like I said, queer people seeing themselves in media in a world where there's not much open representation has always been a way to survive. But the fact that it's musical theater doesn't seem unrelated. Musical theater is still an important part of the queer community. While growing up, I think I found a sort of traditionally gay version of it. I always was into older men, so when I was in college, I mainly slept with and hung around men who were at least over twice my age. Because of that, most of my education on musicals came from them. I learned about Judy, about Barbara, about all of the Broadway divas, and the shows that gay men loved the most. When I realized that I'm trans, this all took on a new meaning. My empathy for the divas took on a different role of wanting to be them, but not just to express femininity. I wanted to be a woman, but the specifically gay male version of musical theater still influences me, and when I listen to Carol Channing, I think about how much of my gay male past is still a part of me today, even if now I'm a straight trans woman. But I think that gay experience is honestly typical. Most gay men I know learned their musical theater through others in the community. Even though the past few decades have seen queer culture being documented more than ever before, there's still an oral tradition. Queer culture is passed down from previous generations. And even if I didn't know what it was like to see operettas in Paris to meet other queer people, I can feel somewhat of a connection with that history. But that's not the whole story. While writing this script, I reached out and asked my followers to tell me about their experiences, and my inbox was flooded with emails that showed me a much larger picture about how musical theater shaped their lives in very queer ways. Some of the emails were from young people who didn't listen to any musicals written before 2003. Others were older and shared wonderful memories of dancing in their mother's shoes to Patti LuPone recordings. And though musical theater is thought of as a queer haven, other emails reminded me of how that's not always the case. Seasoned veterans from the West End and Broadway wrote me to talk about how toxic their work environments are and how they felt pushed out of an industry they were in love with, even criticizing the fact that in 2022 there still isn't enough good queer representation. And some people wrote in depth about the racism they've experienced in the industry, showing that musical theater, just like many queer communities today, still has a lot of racism, and the only way to move forward is to be explicit about the importance of intersectionality and creating anti-racist spaces. But the biggest theme I got in all of the emails was Disney. I'm sure that has to do with what this channel is about, but it also makes me think about Howard Ashman. He was so right when he talked about the Disney animated film developing alongside the US American musical. And for many people, their first experience with musical theater happened way before they were able to make it to a show. It happened in front of a TV, watching Snow White, Aladdin, The Little Mermaid, or a variety of other Disney musicals. And those movies weren't just an introduction to musical theater. They were an introduction to queer expression. Hearing Hercules sing about wanting to find where he belongs hits different for those who knew they were gay from a very young age, and for many people, watching Mulan get in drag gave them permission to see a future in which they could transition. Like I've said before, these archetypes of queer musical theater aren't a replacement for productive representation, but they are a part of queer history. And besides, there's nothing wrong with dreaming. I would go